The Cthar, a species of crystalline insectoids who communicated in perfectly modulated frequencies and considered rounding errors a capital offense, were very, very proud of their gravity chamber. And High Proctor Xylax, who was shaped like a particularly self-important chandelier, was currently in the middle of a monologue explaining just how proud. "Behold, human Maya," he trilled, his voice a complex chord of synthesized chimes that was probably meant to sound imposing but mostly sounded like a doorbell recital. "The Zenith Graviton Projector. A perfect sphere of ion-bonded carbine, 30 meters in diameter, capable of generating a localized gravitational field equivalent to that of a collapsing neutron star. It is, in a word, inescapable. Listen, you and I both know that whenever someone in a position of authority describes their new toy as inescapable, they're basically just begging for it to be escaped from. It's like painting a giant, glowing target on it that says, 'Please apply unforeseen loophole here,' it's just bad form." But Xylax was a creature of pure, unadulterated hubris, a being so convinced of his own logical superiority that if you told him his multifaceted backside was on fire, he'd demand a peer-reviewed study on the combustion properties of his own anatomy before considering a course of action. Inside the chamber, Maya Chen, the human in question, was not beholding. She was, in fact, inspecting a scuff mark her boot had made on the impossibly smooth, matte black floor. She was dressed in a standard-issue gray jumpsuit that screamed, "Intergalactic detainee," and her expression was one of mild, soul-deep boredom. She'd been on this station for 3 weeks, and the novelty of six-legged, crystal-based lifeforms had worn off around the 4th time she'd had to explain the concept of a gut feeling. "The field is generated from a singularity core suspended in a quasi-stable quantum foam 17 decks below us," Xylax continued, gesturing with a delicate, claw-tipped limb towards the floor. A holographic schematic appeared in the air of the observation deck, showing the chamber, the core, and a whole lot of technobabble that was, again, supposed to be impressive. Its precision is absolute. At this moment, you are experiencing a perfectly uniform 12 gravities, calibrated to your homeworld standard, plus a small but psychologically effective 20% increase. We are not monsters. A low grunt came from the corner of the observation deck. This was Grok, the guard. Grok was a Grornak, a species that looked like a stack of boulders had decided to get into bodybuilding and had stopped halfway through. His entire vocabulary consisted of various grunts, which, depending on inflection, could mean anything from "yes, sir" to "I am contemplating the heat death of the universe and find it mildly disappointing." This particular grunt was the latter. Maya, meanwhile, shifted her weight. She wasn't a super soldier. She wasn't a brilliant physicist with 17 PhDs. She was a logistics coordinator from Cleveland who had taken a job with a new interstellar shipping company because it paid well and she was tired of arguing with her landlord about the squirrels in the attic. Her greatest skill was an almost supernatural ability to remain calm while everyone else was losing their minds, a talent honed by years of managing holiday shipping schedules. A pompous crystal bug monologuing about his big gravity ball didn't even rank in her top 5 most stressful workplace situations. "The walls," Xylax chimed, warming to his subject, "cannot be broken. The energy field cannot be disrupted. The controls are, as you can see, out here with us. There is no escape, human Maya. There is only acceptance of your situation." And what a situation it was. You see, Maya hadn't committed some grand act of rebellion. She hadn't stolen state secrets or insulted the Cthar Empress's clutch mother. Her crime, the one that landed her in the galaxy's most over-engineered timeout corner, was far, far worse. She had introduced the concept of rounding. It had happened during a supply audit. The Cthar run their entire civilization on a system of pure, absolute mathematics. Every transaction, every inventory count, every caloric unit consumed is calculated to 37 decimal places. It's a society without approximation. To them, 2999 repeating is a fundamentally different and spiritually inferior number to 3. Maya, trying to streamline a cargo manifest, had looked at a figure like 4,99999999998 units of nutrient paste and said, "Let's just call it 5,000 and save ourselves a headache." The senior Cthar auditor had frozen, its crystalline structure visibly vibrating with existential horror. It was the logical equivalent of showing a vampire a crucifix made of garlic bread. The idea of a number being close enough was not just wrong, it was a form of conceptual blasphemy. It suggested that reality itself was fuzzy, negotiable. The auditor had to be sedated and taken to a quiet room to recalibrate its internal chronometer. The chaos cascaded. Her suggestion, treated as a dangerous mimetic virus, infected the junior auditors who had overheard her. They started, just calling it, things all over the station's supply network. A shipment of 100,000,000,000,001 kilograms of refined silicon became, about 10 kilos, the station's energy consumption for the cycle, 1-214-578-9473389 gigajoules, was logged as, a little over 12 billion. The entire Cthar economic model, a delicate crystalline lattice of absolute precision, shattered. Automated systems, unable to reconcile the rounded figures with their source code, began shutting down. Trade bots entered logic loops and drove into walls. The station's central computer, faced with the philosophical nightmare of an imprecise integer, had what could only be described as a panic attack and rebooted the life support system to a balmy -40 degrees Celsius for 3 minutes. It was a catastrophe. And Maya was the patient zero of this plague of common sense. High Proctor Xilax had personally overseen her trial, which consisted of him explaining for 6 hours how her linguistic sloppiness had nearly caused the heat death of their local star cluster. Her sentence was to be made an example of. She was to be placed in the Zenith Graviton Projector, a device designed to contain rogue black holes, to demonstrate the Cthar's absolute control over the fundamental forces of the universe, the very forces she had so casually disrespected with her verbal heresies. Your crime was an assault on logic itself, Xilax intoned, bringing us back to the present. You introduced a flaw into a perfect system. A conceptual virus. Therefore, you shall be contained by a perfect system. It is poetic. Maya finally looked up from the scuff mark, her expression unchanged. She looked past Xilax, past the horrified junior technicians, and past Grok, who was now examining his own massive knuckles with quiet intensity. She looked directly at the observation window and pressed her hand to the comms panel on her wrist. Question, she said, her voice flat and calm. Xilax paused his monologue, clearly thrown. Prisoners weren't supposed to ask questions. They were supposed to weep or beg or at least look suitably impressed. The human wishes to speak, he announced to the room, as if narrating a nature documentary. Proceed. So, this whole thing, Maya said, making a little circle with her finger to indicate the entire chamber. The gravity. It all goes down, right? Towards the floor. There was a moment of stunned silence in the control room. The junior technicians exchanged confused glances. Gleep, a young Cthar intern whose job was mostly to polish Xilax's honor crystals, tilted his head so far his auditory facets nearly scraped his shoulder spines. It was such a profoundly stupid question. Gravity is the quintessential down force. It's in the job description. Xilax let out a series of chimes that might have been a sigh, or possibly a laugh. It was hard to tell. As is the traditional vector for all localized gravitational phenomena, yes, human Maya. The force is directed downwards. Towards the singularity core. A concept I believe even your species' rudimentary understanding of physics can accommodate. Cool. Cool, Maya said, nodding to herself. She took a deep breath, then stretched her arms over her head like she was getting ready for a morning jog. Okay. Turn it up. Xilax's chimes faltered. I beg your pardon. The gravity, she clarified. Turn it up. Let's see what this thing can do. Now, the confusion in the control room curdled into genuine alarm. This was not on the flowchart for, containing insolent mammals. Xilax's carefully orchestrated display of power was being derailed by the subject's apparent enthusiasm for it. Was this a human psychological defense mechanism? A bizarre form of reverse psychology. You wish for us to increase the gravitational pressure? Xilax asked, his tone dripping with condescension, but now laced with a thread of uncertainty. An unusual request. The standard procedure is a gradual increase over several cycles to encourage compliance. Yeah, no, let's skip that. I'm on a bit of a schedule, Maya said. Let's go to, I dunno, 2GS. For a warm-up. Xilax exchanged a look with his chief technician, a spindly Cthar named Xyler, who immediately began running diagnostics, assuming the human's comm unit was malfunctioning. Grok the guard shifted his weight, a sound like tectonic plates grinding together. He was intrigued. This was more interesting than watching nutrient paste rehydrate. The human is displaying signs of what their psychological profiles refer to as bravado, one of the junior council members whispered to another. A primitive coping mechanism in the face of overwhelming odds. Or she's just an idiot, the other whispered back. Her request is illogical, Xilax announced, regaining his composure. However, denying it would suggest a lack of confidence in our own technology. Very well, he gestured to Xylar. Technician, increase the field intensity to 2 standard gravities. Xylar complied, her delicate claws tapping on the console. Inside the chamber, Maya felt a heavy blanket settle over her. Her knees buckled slightly, but she stayed upright, planting her feet. It felt like carrying a heavy backpack. Annoying, but manageable. On the monitor, the Kthar watched her. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't even grimacing. She was just standing there. Looking around. Satisfied, human. Xilax chimed, a smug note returning to his voice. Not really, Maya's voice came over the comms, slightly strained. Let's try 5. The smugness evaporated. 5. Human Maya, at 5 gravities, your circulatory system will be under extreme duress. Your skeletal structure will begin to microfracture. Yeah, I've done a spin class before. I'll be fine. 5 GS, please. This time, Xilax didn't hesitate. His professional pride had been wounded. This illogical ape was treating his masterpiece of gravitational engineering like a theme park ride. He snapped a command at Xylar, who reluctantly increased the power. Inside the sphere, the world suddenly weighed 5 times as much. Maya grunted and dropped to one knee. Breathing became a conscious effort. It felt like an elephant was sitting on her chest. A very large, very insistent elephant. She slowly, deliberately, lowered herself until she was lying flat on her stomach, face turned to the side, breathing carefully. See, came her voice, muffled and breathy. This is much more comfortable. Way better for the back. The control room was now a hive of frantic, quiet activity. Technicians were monitoring her life signs, which were, impossibly, stable. Her heart rate was elevated, but not dangerously so. Her blood pressure was high, but within the tolerance for a species that had apparently evolved to handle being sat on by elephants. Gleep, the intern, was watching the main screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He was supposed to be taking notes on the psychological effects of prolonged containment. Instead, he was writing a single phrase over and over again on his data slate: the human is not following the script. 10, Maya gasped out. Let's do 10. This is madness. Xylar trilled, turning away from her console to face Xilax. Hi Proctor, her internal organs are at risk of catastrophic failure. The human is attempting to bait us into a display of mercy, Xilax declared, though he was clearly rattled. She believes her self-destructive tendencies will force our hand. A flawed, emotional gambit. We will not fall for it. Give her 10 gravities. The hum of the chamber deepened into a low, guttural growl. Maya felt the pressure intensify tenfold. Every cell in her body screamed in protest. Her cheek was pressed so hard against the floor that she could feel the faint, molecular-level vibrations of the machinery 17 decks below. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. But she could still think. And she could still talk. More, she whispered, her voice a reedy thread over the comms. Xilax was practically vibrating with fury and confusion. His grand, poetic punishment had turned into a bizarre contest of wills, and he was losing. The human wasn't breaking, she was escalating. She was treating the fundamental forces of the universe like a hot sauce challenge. He decided it was time for another lecture. It was his go-to move when logic failed him. If you can't beat them, condescendingly explain physics to them until they give up. Human Maya, he began, his voice amplified into the chamber, a booming, resonant series of chimes that vibrated through Maya's very bones. You seem to be operating under a severe misapprehension of the forces at play. You cannot win this confrontation. You are pitting your fragile biological structure against a fundamental constant of the cosmos, harnessed and focused with a precision your species has yet to dream of. Oh, here we go. The Villain Monologue, Part 2. The narrator in my head was already getting out the popcorn. It's a classic for a reason, I suppose. When your plan is going sideways, just talk more. Maybe the problem will solve itself through the sheer power of your own verbosity. At this very moment, Xilax continued, a diagram of a human body appearing on the holographic display, with angry red arrows pointing at all the squishy bits. The gravitational force is attempting to pull every single atom in your body towards a single point. Your blood, now weighing as much as liquid mercury, struggles to circulate. The electrical signals in your nervous system are fighting against a current of pure spacetime curvature. To request more pressure is akin to a drowning organism requesting more water. It is the pinnacle of illogical self-destruction. Maya didn't respond. She was saving her breath. If we were to increase the field to, say, 100 gravities, Xilax went on, warming up now, your form would lose its structural integrity entirely. You would become a two-dimensional smear of organic matter, a tragic but scientifically fascinating footnote in the annals of Cthar penal science. At 1,000 gravities, your constituent atoms would begin to shear apart. And at the projector's maximum output, a level of gravitational stress we typically reserve for stabilizing microsingularities, you would cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Your mass would be compressed into a point of such infinitesimal size and infinite density that it would briefly form a Kugelblitz, a black hole created from pure energy, before evaporating in a puff of Hawking radiation. He paused for dramatic effect. Do you understand, human? This is not a game. This is physics. And physics, he concluded with a flourish of absolute certainty, always wins. What he was saying, in essence, was, you're gonna get squished, dum-dum, but it takes a special kind of academic pomposity to turn a simple threat into a graduate-level seminar on theoretical astrophysics. There was a long silence from the chamber. The Cthar in the control room held their collective breaths. Maybe the speech had worked. Maybe the human had finally grasped the sheer, crushing finality of her situation. Then, a single, strained, but perfectly clear word came over the comms. Everything. Xilax froze. What? All of it, Maya's voice rasped. Give me everything you've got. Turn it up to max. Let's see that Kugelblitz. Sounds neat. The control room descended into chaos. Not loud, screaming chaos, that wasn't the Cthar way. It was a silent, frantic chaos of vibrating crystals and rapidly flashing console lights. Xyler looked at Xilax with undisguised horror. Gleep the intern dropped his data slate, which shattered on the floor with a sad little tinkle. Grok the guard uncrossed his forearms, a sign of genuine shock. He then slowly, deliberately, crossed them again, as if to physically restrain himself from, well, it was unclear what. Probably from questioning the chain of command. She is insane, a council member trilled. The pressure has addled her primitive mammalian brain. It's a bluff, another countered. A final, desperate act of defiance. Xilax stared at the monitor, at the unmoving shape of the human lying on the floor of his perfect prison. All his logic, all his carefully constructed plans, had led to this. An absurd, illogical demand. She had challenged his authority, his technology, and his very understanding of cause and effect. His pride, a thing as vast and fragile as a nebula, could not let this stand. He would show her. He would show all of them the true, uncompromising power of Cthar science. Very well, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The human wishes to witness the ultimate expression of gravitational force. We shall oblige. He strode to the center of the control room, towards a single, covered console. This was the master override. The big red button. The one you're never, ever supposed to press. With a dramatic flourish, he flipped open the protective cover. Xyler, disengage all safety protocols, he commanded. Hi Proctor, I must object. The energy feedback could destabilize the station's power grid. The containment field. Do it. Xilax chimed, his voice a sharp, angry spike of sound. Xyler, trembling, complied. A series of warning lights on the main console turned from blinking yellow to a solid, ominous red. On my mark, Xilax announced to the silent room, activate the zenith field at 100% capacity. He placed a clawed finger over the activation panel. He looked at the monitor one last time, a final, triumphant glare at the foolish human who had dared to defy him. Activate. The lights on the station dimmed for a full second. A deep, soul-shaking thrum echoed through the deck plates, a sound so low it was felt more than heard. The air in the control room crackled with static electricity. On the monitor, the image flickered. And then, something impossible happened. Maya Chen did not get squished. She did not smear. She did not vaporize into a puff of radiation. She sank. It wasn't fast. It was a smooth, almost gentle process. Her body, lying prone on the floor, simply phased downwards. Her head went first, then her shoulders, her torso, her legs. It looked less like an act of physics and more like a bad special effect from an old movie. She passed through the solid, ion-bonded carbine floor as if it were made of smoke. There was a soft, almost comical schloop sound picked up by the chamber's internal microphones. And then she was gone. The chamber was empty. For a full 3 seconds, everyone just stared at the screen. The only thing moving was the scuff mark she'd made earlier. Then every alarm on the station went off at once. The gravitational field, its target mass having abruptly vanished from spacetime, collapsed catastrophically. The feedback surge blew out half the consoles in the control room, showering the technicians in harmless but very distracting sparks. Status. Xilax shrieked, his voice cracking into a discordant mess of frequencies. What happened? Where is she? Subject is gone. Xyla reported, her voice trembling. Life signs vanished. The chamber is empty. The floor is intact. Its reading is structurally sound. Xilax stared, his multifaceted eyes wide with disbelief. He tapped his console, bringing up the chamber's internal sensor logs. Mass reading, 6,214 kilograms. Then, 000 kilograms. The transition had been instantaneous. She hadn't been destroyed. She had just left. Meanwhile, 17 decks below the observation room, in a dusty, little-used maintenance corridor, a small section of the ceiling sagged downwards for a moment, shimmering like a heat haze. And then, Maya Chen dropped through it, landing on her feet with a soft thud. She stumbled, her legs feeling weirdly light, and braced herself against a conduit pipe. A small, boxy janitorial bot, diligently mopping a patch of grime, stopped. Its single optical sensor swiveled to look at her. It beeped once, a questioning, inquisitive little sound. Then, apparently deciding that a human materializing out of the ceiling was not within its operational parameters for a spill, it swiveled back and resumed mopping. Maya took a deep, shaky breath. The air down here was stale and smelled of ozone and lubricant. She looked up at the ceiling. It was solid metal. Not a mark on it. She patted herself down. Jumpsuit was a little dusty, but otherwise, she was fine. No broken bones. No two-dimensional smearing. Huh, she said to the janitor bot. Would you look at that? It worked. So, here's the thing about the Kthar. They were geniuses when it came to making things. They could build a gravity generator that could give a black hole performance anxiety. But they were so focused on the application of their technology that they never stopped to think about the weird, loopy side effects. They were the ultimate engineers, but terrible physicists. They understood gravity as a force. A big, invisible hammer you could use to smash things. What they didn't appreciate, not really, was what gravity is, a curvature of spacetime. Maya, who had exactly 1 semester of college physics before she switched her major to logistics, remembered a single, crucial concept: a gravity well isn't just a downward force, it's a dent in the fabric of reality. A really, really big dent makes a really, really deep hole. The Kthar had built a machine that could create an incredibly intense, incredibly localized gravitational field. They thought of it as a press. Maya realized it could be an elevator. When they cranked the power to maximum, they weren't just pressing down on her with unimaginable force. They were warping the fabric of spacetime around her into a needle-thin spike. For a fraction of a second, the distance between the floor of the chamber and the ceiling of the maintenance corridor 17 decks below became, from her perspective, less than zero. She hadn't broken through the floor. The floor was still there, perfectly intact. She had simply taken a shortcut through the dimension it occupied. Spacetime had bent to let her pass. It was a loophole not in the chamber's design, but in the design of the universe itself. And it was only possible because the Kthar were too literal to ever conceive of it. They saw an inescapable box. Maya saw a door, and the key was asking the warden to press the open button for her. She found a service ladder and began to climb, heading back towards the chaos she knew she'd left behind. When she kicked open the door to the observation deck, the scene was one of pure, crystalline panic. Xylax was prodding a smoking console with one of his claws. Xyler was attempting to reboot the entire sensor network. Gleep was on the floor, trying to piece his shattered data slate back together. Grok was just standing in his corner, motionless, which was his version of hyperventilating. They all froze and turned to stare at her. She stood there in the doorway, covered in a fine layer of maintenance duct dust, looking mildly annoyed. "Hey," she said, waving a hand. "Just so you know, your floor is fine. It feels a little wavy, maybe. You might want to get that looked at." Xylax's jaw, which was a complex series of interlocking crystal mandibles, hung open. He emitted a soft, sputtering crackle, the sound of a logic circuit frying. "But, how?" Xyler whispered, her voice full of awe and terror. "The walls are indestructible. The field was absolute." Maya shrugged. "You guys kept saying it was inescapable. You never said it was ingo-throughable." Gleep the intern scrambled to his feet. He looked from Maya to the blank screen where she used to be, and a connection was made in his young, logical mind. The heresy of rounding numbers, the illogic of demanding more pressure, the impossibility of her escape, it wasn't madness. It was a different kind of logic. A flexible, weird, human kind. He fumbled for a spare data slate on his belt and scurried over to her, holding it out with a stylus. "Honored human Maya," he trilled, his voice trembling with excitement. "Your methods are unprecedented. May I have your autograph?" Maya blinked, then smiled. "Sure, kid." Xylax, meanwhile, had stumbled over to a functional console, his mind racing. He was pulling up the energy readings, the temporal displacement metrics, the quantum foam stability charts, anything that could explain what had just happened. The screen filled with equations so complex they would make a supercomputer weep. He was trying to calculate the force required to breach the carbine floor, the energy signature of a matter-antimatter reaction, the possibility of a spontaneous wormhole. He was looking for a logical explanation, and his logic was leading him in 1,000 wrong directions. Maya walked over and looked over his shoulder at the screen of frantic, scrolling numbers. "Wow," she said. "That's a lot of decimal places." Xylax ignored her, his entire being focused on the impossible problem. She tapped a long, complicated string of digits on the screen. It was the calculated energy reading from the moment she had vanished, a number that trailed off into infinity. "You know," she said conversationally, "if you just round that number up, it makes a lot more sense." It was the final straw. The ultimate conceptual assault. The two events, her impossible escape and the hated mathematical shortcut, collided in his mind with the force of a supernova. High Proctor Xylax made a sound like a bag of wine glasses falling down a flight of stairs, his multifaceted eyes went dim, and he fainted dead away, collapsing into a neat, glittering pile of unconscious indignation. Grok the guard let out a short, sharp grunt. It was, for him, a standing ovation. Things changed on the station after that. Maya Chen was, of course, immediately released. Her sentence was officially commuted, with the official reason listed as containment system malfunction, because admitting she'd outsmarted the entire Kthar High Command was simply not an option. But unofficially, she became a legend. The human who walked through a floor. The criminal who broke the laws of physics by following them too literally. A week later, she was offered a job. A new position was created just for her, special advisor for nonlinear problem solving. Her first task was to teach a class to a group of promising young Kthar, including a very enthusiastic Gleep, who now followed her around like a devoted, crystalline puppy. She stood at the front of the lecture hall, in front of a holographic display. She was back in her civilian clothes, a comfortable pair of jeans and a hoodie from her university back in Cleveland. "Okay, class," she said, clapping her hands together. Lesson 1, Creative Thinking. Let's start with a simple thought experiment. She conjured up a holographic image of 2 apples. "Imagine you have 2 apples," she said. But the quarterly report requires you to have 3 apples. What do you do? The Kthar students began chiming over each other with logical, precise answers. Calculate the probability of a spontaneous fruit materialization event. Requisition 1 additional apple from the hydroponics bay, citing Regulation 4B/9. Redefine the base unit of apple such that 2 units are mathematically equivalent to 3. Maya held up a hand, silencing them. She smiled. Or, she said, tapping the display and adding a third, slightly misshapen apple, you could just draw 1. Sometimes, the easiest solution is the one that breaks the rules of the problem. A wave of confused, intrigued chiming filled the room. Gleep was taking notes so furiously his stylus was leaving a scorch mark on his data slate. From that day on, the Kthar Empire, that vast and ancient bastion of pure logic, began to change. It became a little less rigid, a little more fuzzy. They learned that sometimes, being close enough was not only acceptable but necessary. Their economy stabilized. Their ships stopped flying into things because their navigation computers were no longer paralyzed by irrational numbers. And it all started because they locked a board logistics coordinator in a box she wasn't supposed to be able to leave. It just goes to show you, the most powerful force in the universe isn't gravity, or electromagnetism, or even the unyielding power of Kthar bureaucracy. It's a human being who has been pushed just slightly too far, armed with a basic understanding of physics and a deep, deep intolerance for smug, long-winded monologues.